Today we're going to talk about pedagogy and epistemology. These are the two main interrelated themes of Module 2 and the focus of your readings. We often talk about learning theory, much less so about epistemology. But epistemology is deeper and broader than theory. Many theories can emerge out of one epistemology, countless, endless. And we often, by understanding epistemology, we understand the underlying assumptions. When we looked at the metaphors that come out of Linda Stone's work, what we could see is that epistemologies often imply what are suitable roles and activities and relationships, language, in the learning experience. So while we often make our learning theories more explicit, often we are not as consciously aware or intentional about epistemology. It's often unspoken or even unaware. Epistemologies ebb and flow, and not surprisingly correspond to the social and political climate of the day or the place. This isn't always a one-to-one correspondence, because something like activist epistemology often is a response, a counter response to a particular social climate. So the advantages of thinking about epistemology, surfacing this, making it conscious when thinking about pedagogy, is that it allows us to analyze the deep structure of pedagogy, the assumptions under it. It gives us some tools to analyze the roles of teachers and students, analyze the relationships between teachers and students, analyze the relationship between knowledge and knower, and to be explicit about what's considered knowledge and thereby understand criteria for assessment. There's a lot more. It also will allow us to understand the levels of freedom that are involved in a particular epistemological or pedagogical process. So what I'm going to do in this current presentation is just look at a few quotes from theorists that represent different epistemological positions in pedagogy, and try to ferret out a little bit the ways that they mirror or enact the epistemology that they spring from. So behaviorism, particularly in its original form, is a pretty pure example of positivism. And so what we should see in the enactment of it are some of the things that we see in the metaphor of the spectator, right? So in this quote from Skinner, he says, I have to tell people that they're not responsible for their behavior. They're not creating it. They're not initiating it. It's all found somewhere else. That's an awful lot to relinquish. And so I think about that spectator view, that distance view. I'm not participating in it. I'm watching it. We're observing it. I'm being objective, and I'm studying human behavior from a distance. And it seems to me that this quote, this idea that that people are sort of being engineered through their environments, that they're being created by what's being reinforced, not by any sense of their own volition, is very, for me, consonant with the spectator view, where you're sort of passively watching, studying, learning what's there to be learned. So we're determined, much as the spectator that's trying to sort of scientifically learn the world. That's how Skinner is looking at human beings, and there's this sort of absence of the internal volition that we see in the other epistemologies. So this statement by Skinner that that's an awful lot to relinquish, this idea that you would have an active role in your own behavior. This parallels for me when we see some of the positivist methods being played out, which are very connected with standardization and attempts to sort of teacher-proof things. We want that objective transmitter of knowledge. We don't want teachers, we want to figure out the best way to teach this, and then we want to standardize it. So we see the same kind of relinquishment of participation in this quote from Dresser, who's talking about how teachers' roles have changed in relationship to the advent of some of the positivist pedagogical practices that have come in as a result of No Child Left Behind. So she says, today, effective and creative teacher-designed instruction is being replaced by scripted reading programs. These programs are changing the role of the teacher in the classroom from professionals to mere transmitters of knowledge. So professionals are people we tend to think they can make decisions based on their professional knowledge. But transmitters of knowledge, or more technicians, basically take that professional knowledge and they just enact it based on a set of rules. So again, we sort of see the same dynamic playing out in Skinner having to tell people, really, it's not what you think or what you do. You're being determined from the outside, to these teachers whose teaching is being determined from the outside. Another sort of piece of behaviorism is, this idea that as the scientist is trying to discover how the physical world works through these objective processes, that we're also trying to understand people through them. That's a very positivist approach. And the idea that all behavior can be explained without the need to consider internal states or consciousness, we see that spectator piece in this. We see that there isn't a sense that we can know this from inside. Then all of a sudden we become subjective, and we know that's not reliable from this paradigm. And so we see this spectator view of human behavior that is completely learned about through observation, because we can't observe the internal states or consciousness. Then we don't need to worry our pretty little heads about that, because the more reliable thing is to try different things and then observe what happens, measure it. So then we get Thorndike, who helps us connect to some of the social and political context, to the ways this is used. And he says, of course, it will of course be understood that directly or indirectly, sooner or later, every advance in the sciences of human nature will contribute to our success in controlling human nature and changing it to the advantage of the Commonwealth. So the idea that if we want to improve civilization, that we figure out how to structure our environments in ways that produce the best kinds of human beings. And so we can definitely see this in education. We can see, education is the socialization tool of most cultures, definitely Western culture. And so that we structure schools to teach obedience and compliance and so many different things that are of benefit to social control. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, just saying that we see this goal acted out. So we see something different with constructivism. And constructivism, remember, we have this metaphor of the conversationalist, this idea that you're not the person who's in control. You're not the announcer at the football game. You're a person in a conversation, and you might not always be able to control the meaning. You're acting and reacting. Your knowing becomes a verb. It's something that you actively do. It's an engagement. It's not just a passive watching. So in constructivism, we immediately, from Piaget and Vygotsky, we get this response to, well, if everything is so determined, like the behaviorists say, then where does anything, how do we evolve? And so both of them talk about play as being the place where we evolve, and where we make new connections between things, where the rules are not set out, where we're free to explore, and the reward is in the process itself. It's the fun of playing. So Vygotsky says a child's greatest accomplishments are possible in play, achievements that tomorrow will become her basic level of real action. And Piaget says play is the answer to the question, how does anything new come about? How do we create? And the goal of education, according to Piaget, is not to increase the amount of knowledge, but to create the possibilities for a child to invent and discover, to create men who are capable of doing new things. And so what we see here in constructivism is a divergent kind of learning, where instead of converging in on the same meaning system, we are wanting to see different points of view, and seeing that as being the substance from which, or the process from which, real learning takes place, and creativity and change. So Brunner, who's a more contemporary, though maybe also dead, I'm not sure, theorist, constructivist theorist, he tells us that education must be not only a transmission of culture, but also a provider of alternative views of the world, and a strengthener of the will to explore them. So we're beginning to see in constructivism sort of the values related to diversity, to related to education as an expansion rather than zeroing in on meaning. And then the Nelson Goodman quote here really gets back to epistemology, and he's a philosopher, not a psychologist, and so this makes sense, but tells us truth cannot be defined or tested by agreement with the world. So he's questioning or countering the very central theme of positivism. And he says not only do truths differ in different worlds, but the nature of agreement between a world apart from it is notoriously nebulous. So he really debunks this idea of correspondence of the mind and the truth that's out there in the world that's so central to a spectator view. And we get instead this idea of an engagement with learning and constructivism. So this brings us to critical pedagogy. So if positive pedagogy is converging in on the meaning that exists out in the world through objective processes, and constructivist pedagogy is more divergent in it, understanding that there are multiple ways, multiple perspectives on things, there are multiple meanings, and that good teaching and learning cultivates an interest in those and an appreciation for multiple perspectives and a play between different ways to create new things. Critical pedagogy then builds on that in saying that if there are these multiple truths, these multiple meanings, these contextualized meanings, then how come we structure the world as if that's not the case? How come particular meanings get to be known as the truth, and particular groups of people's meaning get to be known as the truth, and others' knowledge is not considered as valid? So in the teaching and learning arena then, one of the things that is immediately thought about and questioned and reconceptualized is the relationship between the student and the teacher. And Freire tells us, education must begin with the solution of the student-teacher contradiction, by reconciling the poles of the contradiction so that they're both simultaneously teachers and students. So he's addressing more or less the need to deconstruct the hierarchy of the teacher and student. And he tells us in another place that education can't truly be emancipatory if it's done in this power over way, if it's done in a way that the teacher has power over the student and it's being imposed. So, to the next slide here and try to see why I have it. Okay, so McClure, who is a feminist writer, explains this in a little more depth, because remember, critical theory is going to have some of these same issues and questions around power, the relationship to power. And McClure tells us that within traditional educational settings, the dominant power structure situation structures as superior to students. Feminist pedagogy rejects this normative classroom dynamic, seeking to foster more democratic spaces, functioning within the understanding that both teachers and students are subjects, not objects. So she explains and takes a little further Freire's notion of solving the problem of the teacher and the student. One of the things about critical pedagogy is, so these relationships are really important. We see the activist, we see somebody who's concerned with how education is structured to be more equitable. And the other thing about critical theory, whether it's feminist or whatever stripe that it takes, is this idea that it's not trying to be neutral. So critical research doesn't make these assumptions. Critical pedagogy doesn't make the assumptions of neutrality. And the reason is, according to Freire, is that washing one's hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. There isn't a belief that you can really be neutral. And so if from this stance all pedagogy is taking a stand one way or another, then we should be explicit about it. And that's central to critical pedagogy. It's just a little taste of some of the pedagogical dimensions of or expressions of epistemology, and how the metaphors that we looked at that gets at the structure of those epistemologies, the kind of relationships that they engender, can be seen in the pedagogical expression of it. That it maintains that sort of thumbprint of the epistemology, that shape, that form, that deep structure. And that these are ways then that we can use for analysis, which is what I started out with. So now you're going to read 3 articles about epistemology. One of them is a little less focused in epistemology, a little more focused in theory, and yet it is it's the one on behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism. It focuses more on theory, but it actually makes it a big distinction between cognitivism and constructivism that is epistemological. So look for that. The writers of that, I would say, are post-positivist, and so their interpretations are more generalized and their own subject position less explicit. There is Patricia Hinchy's chapter on constructivism and behaviorism. She will call herself a constructivist. I would call her later on she calls herself more of a critical theorist. So understand that in the Hinchy articles, our chapter, that it's a critical theorist who's constructing what positivism and constructivism are. Understand in the article on behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism that it's post-positivist that's constructing this. So they have a stance. And then the last one is we're back to a critical theorist who's really helping us see how critical theory sort of would play out in the classroom, because that's the one that people have the hardest time imagining. Most people have seen and lived constructivism in the classroom, either as teacher or student. I think all of us have certainly lived behavioral versions of teaching and learning, but not everybody is as clear on what critical theory would look like. So that's the third article. Now, there is a response paper that there's a form to it, a template, and there's a reason for asking you to do this template. The first thing that I'm asking you to do is the APA citation for the article or chapter. There are sort of APA generators that will ask you for the information and generate an APA quote. So if you can find that on the internet if you don't know APA. The next thing after you put the APA citation is to answer this question of what are the epistemological frameworks described in this article and what are the main features of each. And to do that, you can use any form of representation that makes sense to you. You can build a chart. You can look at the chart that we have and that we've used to look at the metaphors and sort of map that on. You can make a mind map. You can write a narrative. Whatever you want to do to sort of show your understanding of the epistemological frameworks is fine. Then you're going to answer the question of what insights did you have or connections did you make. So this is more reflective piece. The first one is representing your understandings. The second one is reflecting on what you learned. And this is really important. What questions do you have? Of everything that is in this template, what questions do you have is the most important as far as me to evaluate your understandings? Because the questions are very telling as far as your levels of understanding. For somebody who reads this and says, I don't have any questions at this point, I have concerns, because as people begin to think about these ideas, and even if you've thought about them before, there are some persistent questions that I think should rise. So this is an important piece. Then I want you to define any unfamiliar terms. Try to find at least 3, but if you don't, you don't. And don't use a dictionary. These are specialized vocabularies, and the dictionary definition is not appropriate in general. In scholarly writing, don't use dictionary definitions. We're dealing in disciplines, and so it's best to use a more in-depth kind of definition than you would get in a dictionary. We've given you some resources on that in the beginning of, I think it's Module 1, but it may be Module 2. And then 3 significant quotes from the article or chapter. This is so later when you need to write a paper. You have your response to this. You have the basic understanding of what the position is. You have some quotes that you can draw on. This is so you can build a paper, and then later, perhaps in another course, draw on these articles that you're reviewing. So you're building up a library, and this is a method to do that. If you have any questions, email me, give me a call. And don't worry about doing this wrong. Just dive in. And At this point, the first week or two, there's a lot of just responses to help you kind of zero in on what you're doing, and I'm not very heavily evaluative in my response. It's more that I'm trying to give you formative feedback to help you in the future. So don't be worried about being wrong. Just jump in. And I can't wait to see what you do. Thanks.